Hello there, people from behind the screen. Today I'm back with the theories again. I haven't done one of these in years, 3 to be exact, which is a lot. But lately the new Piggy installment has caught my eye. For those unaware, I'm talking about Pig 64. When the game first came out, I was kind of disappointed. It didn't really, have that much content, and it felt like a really glorified hunt just to, keep us interested. But looking deeper into it, it reveals really interesting details about the story, I would say. In fact, I believe we can use this game to better understand and piece together a timeline for Piggy, something that wasn't really needed until now. So, without further ado, let's get started. A small warning though, I'm about to attempt to explain some weird company shenanigans that appear in the thesis, and aren't really that important overall, so feel free to skip this part. I'll try to leave a timestamp. So yeah, let's just continue. Within the lore, Pig 64 is a game developed by NetKids and coded by Ronald, a rat who we learn from in the various teasers to be some sort of employee of protection services through mechanics and machines. I will refer to that company as the PTMM from now on, so it doesn't really, get that heavy to say. Throughout these tapes, 2 different companies are mentioned though, the PTMM and the EEP. This poses a bit of an issue because we've already established that, Ronald works for NetKids, but he also seems to be affiliated with the PTMM. In fact, we see a picture of Ronald holding a prototype of the console that is eventually released with Pig 64, which, seems a little bit strange. How could he be part of both companies? That is, unless one of the companies is owned by the other, and I suspect this to be NetKids. I believe the PTMM owns that company. I kind of lied at the start. Ronald is never really confirmed to be part of the PTMM, at least not directly. He's just shown presenting his prototype, the picture we just talked about. Malson uses it as pretty much propaganda to advertise his company as a really helpful and effective safe place, right? But clearly his works are very different from those of Kona or Eddie, who develop robots and protection systems, while he just develops a prototype of a console. That's why I believe that the PTMM is the parent company of NetKids. With that out of the way, because it was just to sort of clarify how I see this, let's try to fit this game into the actual timeline. I will admit, it's not that easy, or at least it wasn't at launch. I mean, the game is supposed to be an in-universe game, taking place before the infection, yet somehow Mr. P appears, mourning his wife's condition. In fact, the Pig 64 hunt, as I like to call it, is riddled with references to this sweet potato. It felt contradictory, but I think I managed to solve it somehow. First of all, we have to determine which years are confirmed to be part of the Piggy timeline. As of now, there are 2, 1970 and 1984. 1970 or 1971 is around the time when the original videos were filmed, while 1984 is a date kind of just thrown out there. We find it during the hunt when we needed to go back to the main Piggy game and insert it into the keypad at the carnival to be able to continue with the quest. But for the most part, it wasn't mentioned again, and that's kind of a big deal. That was until we got the first teaser for part 2. The most notable part of the teaser is the date August 2nd, 1984, that being when the free DLC game releases in-universe. So this gives us a clue to the game's release date and the year in which the main game takes place. Now, it has been a topic of discussion on Twitter especially, when Piggy Book 1 and 2 take place. Many believe it's the 2000s decades after the original video. You see, the main and only argument that I see circling around to support this theory comes from Eddie's age. Right? He's shown as an old man in the mansion chapter, which presumably takes place before the infection, but in the teasers he appears fairly young in comparison. However, I don't think that's enough evidence. I mean, he could very well be in his 50s or 40s in those pictures, most likely 50s, and I'll explain why this is important in just a minute. I mentioned earlier 1984 and how Part 2, the DLC, was released that year. Now, that's important because it must mean that the game was, of course, made before that date, presumably somewhere in that same year. Pig 64 is riddled with references to Mr. P though, more specifically references to him lamenting over his sick wife. This indicates that the game has to also have been in development while the cure was being researched, and we know both that the cure wasn't researched for that long and that a Pig 64 DLC came out in 1984, short after the game itself and before the infection. Thus, that means Piggy must take place in either 1984 or 1985, just to give a little more wiggle room. So given all that, I believe we can sort of assume what the events of the actual timeline are. More or less in 1960-something, hardware and software engineer named Ronald, employee of Netgear, gets to showcase his first ever prototype of a console to the company's higher-ups, and seems to impress them enough to get it approved. He spends a couple of years perfecting and furthering developing his 64-bit console along with his team, and eventually they managed to launch the console. Eventually, Ronald and his team would begin to work on a game for the system, the game in particular being Pig 64. But something tragic would happen around that time. During the time of development, an unknown billionaire and possibly mayor of Lucilla, who was also an investor on the company that owned Netgear, would suddenly find his wife sick with a newly discovered and very possibly deadly disease. Despite not being close to Mr. P, Ronald probably was touched or something by the story and decided to include hints towards this grief that Mr. P was feeling. We don't really know why he included that in. We just know that it is in there. Pig 64 eventually released in 1984, but something strange happened to the early copies. Some strange glitch caused those who were curious enough to try to glitch into the warehouse to stumble upon a mirrored and distorted world, one which incentivized them to kill one of the players in order to reach the level. Ronald hadn't programmed this in, as far as we know. It was as if something had taken over the game. The higher-ups quickly caught on to this and temporarily banned all those curious players before they could reach the warehouse. As for Mr. P, he'd continue to develop his cure for his wife and eventually finish in either 1985 or 1984 itself, and starting the infection shortly after. Now, I will say I added a bit of my own interpretation to tie in the story together. We do know that Piggy must take place in those years, but we don't exactly know if Ronald did or didn't program that in, if Ronald actually added Mr. P or Mrs. P Easter eggs, or whether or not an entity was messing with it. Even though I believe Theo or some other insolent overlord to be behind it, mainly due to the distorted aspect of the last world, the call request to kill a player, and the purple and black colors that make up this section. That being said, I hope you enjoyed this theory. It's been hard to get it on, but I want to hopefully put it out before the second part releases. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you sooner or later.